All right, this is a remake of my presentation at the 2022 International Society for the Scientific Study of Subjectivity Conference, which took place this year. Um, I presented this on Friday, September 16th, and anyway, I'll try to make this as close to the original as possible. It was pretty popular. So this talk is about quantum aspects of Q methodology, Stephenson's 5 articles in the Psychological Record Revisited. And I'm Sue Ramlow, and I have my own company, Susie Q LLC, as well as I am a professor at the University of Akron. So this talk encompasses a brief introduction to William Stephenson, an introduction to quantum physics on a everyday kind of scale. I'll discuss briefly each of the 5 papers, and then we'll get to our conclusions. So as you probably know, William Stephenson had PhDs in physics and in psychology. He studied with Spearman when he was getting his PhD in psychology, and Spearman is considered the father of factor analysis, which is used in psychology research as well as other social and behavioral sciences, but is based on the same mathematics as quantum physics. So Stephenson published 14 articles specifically addressing the connections between quantum physics and Q methodology. But you'll notice that they didn't begin until the early 1980s, and then he was quite prolific. The 2018 paper is a reprint in, I believe, Operant Subjectivity, our I4S journal. But when Stephenson penned his study of behavior text in 1953, right, he only really hinted about these quantum physics connections. In 1981, he wrote, "It was only late in the 1970s that I could satisfy myself about the pragmatics of quantum theory in subjective science. It required the putting together of communication theory, concourse theory, the operancy of factors, and Newton's fifth rule to make tangible what had previously been mainly an exciting analogy between physics and psychology." Yet it is unclear if this was always the plan or if he had waited to include quantum physics after he really had established, right, kind of the details of Q methodology. In 1988, Stephenson stated that the creation of Q technique in 1935 marked the beginning of bringing quantum physics to psychology. However, the origin of drawing quantum aspects into Q remains somewhat unclear. Yet, Stephenson makes his psychological postulates clear. First, any psychological event, which he called a PE, can be transformed to quantum stuff by a concourse of self-referential statements belonging to the psychological event. Second, operant factor structure for the psychological event is subject to Bohr's principle of complementarity, providing psychological quanta, the fundamental phenomena in subjective nature. What he was really saying here is that we need this operant factor structure to provide the multiple divergent views that exist about that psychological event, that there isn't one viewpoint about any psychological event. That's what differentiates Q methodology from the quantum aspects of typical psychology research, especially during Stephenson's time, right? That's what he was talking about when he talked about that quantitative approach to psychology research as Newtonian, right? The thought that there is only one answer, not multiple answers, like there can be in quantum physics. So a little bit of an introduction to quantum physics. It's not scary, right? So Niels Bohr, who Stephenson wrote about quite a lot and is mentioned in each title of the 5 papers we're going to discuss. Bohr said, quantum mechanics has led to a complete revision of our conception of the nature of matter and much more. And this is really how Stephenson saw Q methodology relative to other types of research. It was a complete revision of the concept of understanding and studying subjectivity. So in quantum physics, we talk about probability functions, which combine objective and subjective elements. Heisenberg wrote that, not really in 2007, but the text was from 2007. And Bohr talked about complementarity in relation to the duality of light particles that act like waves, or waves of light that act like particles. The problem is that these two concepts, that light is a particle and light is a wave, are complementary, not in conflict. We need both types to explain what physically happens, what the nature of light really is. Thus, complementarity represents the idea that two contrasted theories are necessary to explain a set of phenomenon or a situation. So, in other words, light, it's a wave, it's a particle. It's a particle that acts like a wave. It's a wave that acts like a particle. Not really sure, but we know that we have to talk about light in both of these ways, just like we can have a psychological event and look at how different people view that event, right, represented by factors, or how a person sorting under multiple conditions of instruction might have multiple views based on the condition of instruction. For instance, if you were a child, right, as you are now, right, as your mother saw you as a child, as your mother might see you as an adult, something to that kind of thing, right? They're not going to be all one viewpoint. So Q meets quantum. Q factors are representations of likelihoods, not of certainties. So this is very much connected to, in a lot of ways, the Zoom Q presentation this past week by Bob Braswell related to his chapter in Cultivating Q Methodology, right? That we can explore different factor solutions, but all of the solutions are based in empirical data. But I can get one set of factors from a set of Q sorts. Right? Somebody else might get something slightly different, or perhaps how they analyze the data, they might get 3 factors. And I have those 3 factors, but I also have a 4th factor. So that's what we mean by likelihoods, not of absolute, right, certainties. It's not objective, it's subjective. Stephenson also explained that although Q factors that emerge from the analyses are implicit and operant, each Q sort provides a probability distribution, just like a quantum state. And in fact, Stephenson often referred to the factors as states of feeling. So now let's focus on Stephenson's 5 papers in the psychological record, all of which are inspired by physicist Niels Bohr and psychologist William James. So this is the series. There is a series of 5, and the first paper was written in 1986, as was the second paper, Pragmatics of a Thought. Schrodinger's Cat was in 1987, and The Significance of Time and Phenomenology of Subjectivity were both published in 1988. And during this presentation, Rob Logan mentioned afterwards that Stephenson was not well when he wrote these. He was having some health problems, but also that he wanted to preserve and explain a lot of the underlying framework of Q methodology, and the opportunity presented by Psychological Record to do this series, which initially he hadn't planned on as 5 articles, helped him do that. This is really a case of explaining, right, the underlying philosophical bases of Q. And this is just the citations. Notice that William James and Niels Bohr and Complementarity are the beginning of each one of these papers' titles, and then, right, we have 1, Concepts 2, Pragmatics. So I'm just going to just look at the title part after the William James, Niels Bohr, and Complementarity as we look at each paper. So as I mentioned, the Concepts paper was written in 1986. Here, Stephenson introduces complementarity as presented by William James in 1891 regarding psychology, and by Niels Bohr basically 30 years later, 40 years later almost, regarding physics. So William James introduced the idea of complementarity in psychology, right, saying that thought is divisible into transitive and substantive parts. By this, he really means subjective and objective parts, but he doesn't use that terminology, right? But we need to have both of those things to explain thought. Bohr talked about complementarity within the framework of nature and light, right? So he applied complementarity in physics. And again, this is just the underlying concepts, and he talks quite a bit about the background of William James and Niels Bohr. He also writes, there is obvious indeterminacy of quantum action in every thought we have, in every experience of free will. The most obvious phenomena of all psychology, that of thought, was grasped by James and now by great physicists as demanding quantum theoretical exploration. Thousands of scientific journals and tens of thousands of psychologists all over the world continue, ostrich-like, enveloped in an ideal causality that cannot possibly explain a simple thought. So here he's simply stressing that thought requires complementarity, that there is no ideal causality, which is how the quantitative psychology researchers were approaching things, and often still do. In his second article, also again 1986, Pragmatics of a Thought, Stephenson differentiates his Q methodology from the classical and causality science of psychology by describing it as quantum theoretical. And he talks about psychology's embrace of quantitative research and post-positivism as limiting. Q methodology offers a new epistemology for the study of subjectivity that is based in transitive thought, complementarity, and quantum physics. In Schrodinger's Cat, which you may be familiar with regarding quantum physics, right? The idea that we have a cat in a box. If we open the box, right, or we want to guess, right, the cat could be alive or it could be dead, right? Or it could be both alive and dead, right? It's the idea of a rejection of classical physics, and Stephenson does the same here for classical psychology, right? He calls for rejecting causation, determinism, and reductionism. If you're very familiar with our methodology, right? R factor analysis is a reductionist, right, methodology, but that's not how Stephenson saw the factor analytical stage of Q. Instead, Stephenson offers an alternative, Q, that embraces the role of the observed, self-reference, communicability, and complementarity. And in this one, as the ones that follow, Stephenson provides a single case study to frame the concepts discussed, right, and how Q provides something unique that cannot be offered, right, by this classical psychology research. In The Significance of Time, written in 1988, Stephenson discusses time, metaphysics, and Q's time independence, right, where he talks about disciplines such as the humanities are time dependent, right? Things happen at certain points of time, right? He was a man of the period that he was in, so, we couldn't have expected him to embrace equality or something, right? It's time dependent. But in sciences, that's not true, right? And Stephenson saw the same for Q methodology, right? It's time independent. And in the fifth paper, Phenomenology of Subjectivity, Stephenson describes how Husserl's work regarding phenomenology is reducible to Q methodology because it embraces some of the same philosophy of science principles that Q does, including the idea of complementarity, although I'm unsure if those who use phenomenology would call it complementarity, but it has to do with, my understanding, with structure, right? And that, again, there's not one absolute, right, answer. So phenomenology is the philosophical study of the structures of experience and consciousness. Here, it's important to note that Stephenson talked about communicability, not consciousness. He didn't think Q was a type of phenomenological methodology either. He was just talking about the parallels. So some commonalities across the 5 papers. There's quite a bit of repetition across the papers, but you kind of have to get over that. You have to remember that each of these is a standalone paper. He didn't know whether people would read them from, right, concepts 1 all the way through to 5 phenomenology. So it makes sense that there is some repetition. They are incredibly insightful. I very much recommend reading each one of these. Actually, I recommend reading them in the order in which they were published. Also, right, he draws on quantum physics and complementarity in each paper. And he makes a lot of philosophical connections, right, while also talking about research in general and understanding, right, subjective science versus objectivity, quantum physics versus Newtonian physics. Some other highlights. Stephenson attempted to explain that Q methodology involved using a tool, Q technique, which is the Q sort, that provides the instrumentation to observe, yet not to interfere with the phenomenon of interest, right? So the only way to collect the necessary data is through Q technique. In this way, the Q sort is the measurement tool that provides the necessary quantum stuff required for factor analysis in Q methodology, right? Here he's also differentiating Q methodology from Q factor analysis, that of Cyril Burt. Additionally, the factor analysis Q method is necessary to provide the natural mathematical structure of the phenomenon. That's when we talk about operancy, right? We're talking about seeking a structure not that has the highest or Q sorts with high loadings on one factor and low to 0 factors on the other factors. We're not looking for simple structure. We're looking for operancy. We want to have the structure of the phenomenon represented mathematically. That's why theoretically, right, centroid made more sense. It's this idea of states of feeling, of something that is not, right, that's a probability function. And again, right, he talks about the interconnectedness of thought between our methodology or our factor analysis and classical physics, as well as just quantitative research in general looking for, we'll call it one correct answer. And Q methodology, which is much more aligned with quantum physics, where again, we talk about probability functions. There is always, right, there are limitations, but there is wiggle room, right, in that, not to get into quantum too much, but there are always these, you can have this value between -1 and 1, and you probably aren't going to have a 2 or a 0, right? So there's that interconnectedness. So overall, Stephenson was stressing the importance of understanding the quantum aspects of Q in order to best scientifically study subjectivity. Right? These aspects provide the underlying framework of Q, and in my mind, it is just really stressing the fact that Q is not just a set of procedures. There is a lot more there. When people do their first Q study, right, it's usually focused on the procedures and getting through to figure out how to collect the data and how to analyze the data. But there's so much more going on, so that might be your first experience. But the second experience is much more enlightening, and you can start to understand, right, this difference between Q methodology and quantitative research, right? Newtonian versus quantum physics. Thank you.